Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Russell, Vice President, Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity, Inclusion for WTTW and WFMT, and welcome to today's Chicago's Tonight Voices, a WTTW News Community Conversation, Politics and the Power of the Vote. WTTW is committed to producing and presenting trusted, best-in-class content fueled by distinctly Chicago sensibility. We have served as Chicago's window to the world, and our purpose is to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. Today, you will hear from WTTW News Spotlight Politics team, in which they will explore key election topics, discussing insights on key issues and strategies shaping races from Cook County to the White House. Now, before we get started, I'd like to thank our generous supporters and donors, sponsors of WTTW members and viewers like you who make this possible. For WTTW to bring provocative ideas to life, to tackle the issues that matter, and to expand on our perspective on the world in which we live. There is only one reason why this is possible, and that reason is you. Thank you for your support. Now, please welcome our hosts, Brandis Friedman, the Alexandra and John Nichols Chief Correspondent and Anchor for Chicago Tonight and Black Voices.
Tim, thank you. And thanks to those of you who are joining us. And I'm looking forward to this conversation with the awesome team that I work with because they know this subject well. I think, as everybody knows, Election Day is just a week away, literally a week from tomorrow. So we're almost through it. Many people have already taken advantage of early voting options to get their civic duty out of the way. But then there are also some who they enjoy the process of voting on election day. Many people are still trying to determine who they're even going to vote for, as well as get a better handle on the issues, both at the local and national level. I was even just a few minutes ago looking up something that is on my ballot and figuring out which way I want to vote on it. So we hope that today's conversation will help you better understand the issues. Of course, WTTW News is committed to maintaining the highest level of trust, independence, professionalism, and integrity in the service of our members, our viewers, and our community. So viewers, I think you know this, you're all in a listen-only mode, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. You can be a part of the conversation, so please chime in on that chat function with your questions and your comments, and I'll be sure to share them with our guests. Speaking of guests, let's start by introducing today's panel from WTTW, the WTTW News Spotlight Politics team. I'm going to welcome Heather Sharon. Come on down. She is a senior reporter for WTTW News, covering Chicago and Illinois politics based out of Chicago City Hall. Heather joined WTTW News in 2020. Joanna Hernandez is a Chicago Tonight correspondent and host of Latino Voices, and she has a passion for telling stories about people and organizations that make an impact in their communities. And Joanna joined WTTW News in 2021. And Amanda Venicky is a Chicago Tonight correspondent and host of Chicago Week in Review on Fridays. She focuses primarily on Illinois government and politics, though her insatiable curiosity leads her to cover a little bit of everything. And Amanda joined WTTW News in 2017. Welcome, team. Good to see you. Hi. All right. So, of course, we know the presidential race is a thing. We got to talk about that. But I want to actually start a little bit closer to home with you, Heather. Remind us why Chicagoans are electing a school board next week.
Well, it's complicated, but essentially, Chicagoans have never had the power to elect their own school board representatives in the entire history of the city. And this is designed to shift control of the Chicago public school system, which is the fourth largest in the nation, from mayoral control, which the way it's been since 1995, to under the power of a 21-member board. Now, like I said, it's really complicated. So everyone who lives in Chicago is going to see on their ballot candidates for one seat on that school board. Now, that means that the whole city will elect 10 representatives to the school board. Now, Mayor Brandon Johnson will still have the power to appoint 10 other members to the school board, plus the board chair. Now, they will serve until the next election when the rest of those seats will be elected by Chicagoans. So it is very complicated, and it made more complicated by the fact that unless you've been living under a rock, you know that the public schools are sort of in the midst of a financial crisis as the end of COVID-19 aid has come upon us. And there are real questions about whether the district CEO, Pedro Martinez, should still serve. So there are a lot of questions facing Chicago voters. And I think, what we will all be looking for when we start getting results is whether or not the candidates who win are supporters of charter schools and privatization efforts, or if they are more aligned with the Chicago Teachers Union, who of course is closely aligned with the mayor and supports his visions for the school. Next week's elections will sort of give us a glimpse into the future, at least the near-term future for the school district.
And to that end, since you brought it up, Heather, what do we know about who's backing the candidates, Heather or Amanda?
Well, so I'll just add, so the main players, as Heather indicated, are the Chicago Teachers Union, which is really spending a bundle of money. And then there are outside organizations that are spending sometimes in coordination with and sometimes not in coordination with candidates that are more the privatization charter, or I would even clearly that is the point of the spenders, but I think it's also seen as sort of an anti-CTU vote largely. And then there are those who aren't getting money from either. I will share that I'm in a district right now that's really interesting. You have one of each, plus a write-in candidate, and then some, like I said, so a CTU candidate, somebody who I'm getting mail from that is backed by the charters, and then another who's trying to run an independent bid, has some money, has political backing. So this is not your same tried and true race. You're seeing very different allegiances. Democrats who normally would stick together are breaking up. This is almost like a primary race, but it's going into the general election. So I think also it's just different because, as Heather noted, it's confusing, right? With all that is going on with CTU, plus just electing 10 people, that's a lot. People might not be sure what the district boundaries are. It's hard to get information about these candidates and know their stances. I'll share that sometimes the mail, it may say who's paying for it, but it's some sort of like innocuous group. It's not necessarily something as easy to tell as CTU. So I think there were a lot of hopes and many years of efforts for the state to give Chicagoans this power. But I think that the complications are sort of landing it to be really a test of dollars. And we'll see how much people really feel like they are having a democratic voice, or whether this is a fight of the well-financed giants.
And I want to mention to our viewers while you're with us, and Tim just dropped this in the chat as well, the WTTW News Voter Guide is also a place you can go to get some answers to some of these questions if you are confused about what the issues are and what to vote for, as if you're still in the process of making that decision. We also know, though, that the mayor appointed new board members recently. They just took their seats last week. So how does that that set of new appointments, Heather, fit in with an election in a week where we're supposed to be electing a board?
Yeah, this is part of what's really complicated. Now, the mayor will have to reappoint sort of his picks for the school board. So the picks that he just made and the people who just took office will not necessarily continue to serve in January. The mayor will have to sort of make a new slate of picks, and he will only be able to appoint people from the opposite side of each school district. So again, really complicated. 10 school districts, 2 members from each district will make up that 20 members plus the chair. So, but the appointed members after January cannot come from sort of the same side of the district. They, the General Assembly in its inestimable wisdom divided up the city into these 10 districts, divided each district into 2 halves. So each side of each school district must be represented on the board. And that means that the mayor is going to have to make sure that, for example, he's not appointing 2 people who live on the same side of the district that includes Lakeview, let's say. And this is really designed to ensure that there is geographic diversity on the school board, because Chicago, we all know, is a very segregated city. And there was a significant concern that without these sort of rules in place, you would have a majority school district where the majority of students are Black and Latino, governed by a board of mostly white, wealthy Chicagoans. And that is not equitable. And so these rules, the complications are there for a purpose. How it all sort of works out, I think, is very much to be determined. And I think that it's probably unlikely that we will sort of know immediately sort of how this is all going to shake out right after Tuesday, because we know that if this election is anything like previous elections, as many as half of all voters are going to vote by mail. Depending on when those ballots come back in, they can take a little bit of time to process and verify. There's a fantastic animated explainer voiced by none other than Amanda Vinicky, who will explain the whole process. And so these races could be decided by no more than several hundred votes. So it's going to take a little while for this all to shake out. I would imagine it's going to take an additional number of weeks for the mayor's team to sort of figure out who he wants to appoint to the board. So it will likely not be until January till we have a sense of sort of what that first school board looks like under not total mayoral control for the first time since 1995.
And let me bounce on that, Heather, just briefly, that it is still going to be mayoral control, because despite this, as Heather noted, he will be choosing the 10 members from these sort of A and B sides, if you pick it, of the 10 districts, and also the board president. So no matter what, he is going to have a majority of the board. There also is likely one district, and I'm sorry, I forget which number right now. Heather probably knows, where the candidate is already really aligned with Mayor Johnson and has no opposition. So he's already really going to be able to get his way. I think, however, despite the mayor pushing back that, like, it's not fair to describe what's going on with Chicago public schools as tumultuous right now, it clearly is, because you're having all of this turnover, these new members. And again, as Heather had just said, we don't know how many of them are going to be able to continue. So this notion was that he wanted to appoint new members so that there would be, he says, stability carrying through when the elected board members come on. However, we don't know how many of these current members will actually have the opportunity to stay until this election is decided. So there certainly is a lot of turnover that is happening at the board level, at the very least. And potentially the new board members have been asked, and the new board president has not said what is going to happen with CEO Pedro Martinez, but it certainly seems as if we're going to have change at the top. That would not be unexpected.
And Amanda, I just want to add, like, one thing that Heather was saying as well, like, it could take some time with regards to once the mayor's team figures out, okay, who from here, there, and, the rest of the districts do I have to choose from once the election has happened. I will say he was ready rather quickly, though, after the first board resigned. He came quick with a set of names to replace them, the folks who just took their seats last week with that board. So I think it was something that he was ready for, and again, that he's ready for. I would imagine his team is probably working off of a list, and will be, depending on what steps this current board takes before that next one is sworn in. I'll be curious to see how quickly he feels like he needs to move to fill those seats, if he needs them to do something for him. Okay, keeping it moving, because we got to talk about the state's attorney's race. Eileen O'Neill Burke is running as the Democrat against former Alderman Bob Fioretti running as the Republican. Heather, is this an office that a Republican can actually win?
Well, a Republican hasn't won this seat for nearly a generation. It would be, I think, a major upset if Bob Fioretti were able to reclaim a countywide seat. There are no Republican countywide office holders. And in fact, there's only one member of the Board of Commissioners who is a Republican. I think that the conventional wisdom is that this race was decided during the Democratic primary, which Eileen O'Neill Burke won by just the slimmest of slim margins. If she does win the general election, she will replace Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx, who served 2 terms and decided not to run for a 3rd term after a very, very newsy time in office, for lack of a better word. And I think that because O'Neill Burke ran to the right of her primary challenger, Clayton Harris III, she has been able to sort of speak to sort of, people who might otherwise be inclined to vote for the Republican candidate and say, look, I am not, sort of seeking to sort of replicate what Kim Foxx did while she was in office. She's promised to take a tougher line on shoplifting and, has not been sort of as outspoken about the need to address the potential wrongful convictions that, sort of exist in Chicago and Cook County. So that, I think, is designed to appeal to a number of Republican voters who were otherwise skeptical about Kim Foxx. But let's not forget, Kim Foxx won re-election relatively handily last time around. Chicago is a majority Democratic city. Cook County is a majority Democratic county. In this era of, polarization, ticket splitting, which used to be more common, is becoming increasingly rare. And I think it would take really sort of a major sort of upset for Bob Fioretti to succeed where he's failed several times in the past, running for Cook County Board President, along with any number of other offices, to sort of get over the finish line on this one.
Ticket splitting rare, but Jesse Jackson, we know, has called for his, people who follow him to do just that, to vote at the top for Vice President Kamala Harris to be president, and then when you get a little bit further down, to vote for Bob Fioretti to be Cook County State's Attorney. So we'll see if that has any impact. I do want to get to a question from a viewer. Thank you for this question. Why was there not a debate for Cook County State's Attorney? Anyone?
So the simple answer is that Eileen O'Neill Burke declined to attend debates with Bob Fioretti. Bob Fioretti had called for there to be a series of debates. She declined. They have done appearances where it's sort of been one speaks and then another speaks, but no formal debates. And I think that's really an indication that O'Neill Burke feels like she is pretty far ahead. And in those sort of situations, the conventional wisdom is that you don't want to elevate your opponent and maybe take the chance that you're going to say something that you regret or create some sort of controversy, because sometimes the best offense is just not doing anything.
And that's really what we've seen. I mean, she has not been running a true campaign in the traditional sense, like she's worried about losing. And that's why you don't have a debate. It is not because we, of course, did not want to host one. We would have relished that opportunity.
Yeah. So another race in Cook County, and this could have been decided in the primary as well. It's Clerk of the Circuit Court of Cook County. The incumbent, Iris Martinez, lost in the primary. Ladies, why is this office? What is this office and why is it important?
Joanna, you want to start this one? I know you've interviewed Iris Martinez several times.
You go ahead, Amanda.
Okay, yeah. I mean, sorry, not trying to. I just, I do think I'll start politically first of all, just because I think it is really interesting that Iris Martinez had sort of galvanized her own supporters against early on, before it was the cool thing to do, denouncing Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. And so she got this position without the backing of the Cook County Democratic Party. And initially anyway, she had, and so she is now, she had tried to hold on to it as well without their support. didn't get that. Really, most of the sort of slate that she had formed was unsuccessful in their attempt to either break into or in some cases hold on to their positions. So this really is, I think, a loss for Latino power. Um, and uh and to her, we don't know where she is going to be going politically after this. This is a really important position that I think is one of those where you might not know who holds it and you might not know a ton about the job itself, but the office is one that holds a lot of meaning for you if you have anything to do with sort of filing for any civil measure within the boundaries of Cook County, which frankly is most of us, right? And so that's why this is a significant measure or a significant office. Again, the Democrats clearly, I think, have the advantage here. That's why it's not getting a ton of attention, because it played out truly in the primary.
Okay, so let's move over to Congress a little bit, because the Illinois delegation, we know, dominated by Democrats. And before we talk about the House, you know what? We don't even have to talk about the House. The House is the House. But let's talk about someone who is not on the ballot this year, but may or may not be on the ballot in 2 years. That is Senator Dick Durbin, who is 79 years old right now, right? When's his birthday? He's been in the Senate since 1997. He is the Senate Majority Whip, which makes him the #2 Democrat in the Senate. What's the status of power in that chamber? Do we expect him to run again?
You can see Amanda shaking her
Amanda's
head, and
shaking her head.
I will agree. I think it would be a big surprise for many Illinois politicians who have been working feverishly behind the scenes to position themselves to, spring into action as soon as Durbin announces his retirement. He is old. He would be the first to admit it. He has had some health issues over the last several years, and when he ran for his last term 6 years ago, he did so, he said, somewhat reluctantly. Now, he has enjoyed really sort of an immense amount of power in Washington. He is the #2 Democrat in the Senate. And of course, we all know that control of the Senate right now hinges sort of on a number of different races, specifically in Montana and Nebraska, and perhaps even Texas. It is not clear whether the Democrats will be able to keep control of the Senate. If they do, that means that Dick Durbin and Chuck Schumer of New York will sort of continue to have sort of, a significant amount of power for at least the next 2 years. What happens after that, I think, is very much an open question. But there will be no shortage of people either quietly tossing their hat in the ring or launching a full-scale election as we get closer to that. But let's do one election at a time, okay, Brandis? We've got enough on our plate.
No, I'm way ahead. I'm super excited about the next election in 2 years. And I do want to clarify something that we mentioned earlier. We did not actually invite Eileen O'Neill Burke and Bob Fioretti for a candidate debate forum, but of course we look forward to speaking with them both in the future. Okay, so we got to talk about the presidential race because that's coming too. Joanna, I want to bring you in on this. Haven't forgotten about you. Thank you for your patience. So you've covered the campaign. Obviously, you've talked particularly with and about Latino voters. Give us a sense of the complexity of the Latino electorate. We know that they're not a monolith, but of course, what are some of the issues that are on their minds?
Also, the conversation has been very interesting. So Heather and Amanda, you guys have been on it. There's always something to learn, but it's been complex really because there's different groups of Latino voters. And that's, I think, the most interesting part in this election. As we know, it's no surprise the census has reported that the Latino population has increased over the years, but not necessarily they've seen that at the polls. But recently there has been obviously a big push to get that Latino vote out there. And what's been even more interesting is just to see how two different parties and how the different groups rationalize what's important to them, right? From the economy, from religion, from immigration. And it's been interesting to see how that diverts them or how that takes them into where they're going to vote and what issues are important to them. I remember having a panelist on, he was a professor from Northwestern, and he started talking about how both campaigns have been a battle of words and people have called it the vibes election. So it's interesting to see how there's obviously been a lot of talk about the Latino vote for Trump, but also the increase in support for Harris once, President Biden dropped out. So, I mean, another topic of conversation, of course, is why are Latinos voting for Trump? And what surrounds that topic and what I've heard from different parties is, which I found interesting, was that a lot of Latinos, they are Americanized, right? They're Americanized, they're assimilated. Many of us have lived here for years, or people have lived here for years, decades, in fact. And they don't want to be associated with immigrants or being migrants. And then there's other people, of course, groups of people who have parents who've migrated here from different countries, and that's something that they carry with them. So these topic of conversations have been really interesting. I do think that in some way the vote is split among Latinos. And a lot of it has to do also with religion. I mean, I know, we talked to a group of evangelicals. Historically, white Protestants tend to vote for the Republican candidate. And in this instant, they were seeing that the Latino evangelicals were up for grab. We did have two different panelists who were voting for Harris, one for Biden, and the question for the person who was voting, even though they both had very similar interests, very similar in terms, they agreed obviously with their religion and what they believed in. Yet when asked the Trump supporter, what do you think about someone who talks, bad about different cultures, or someone has not used the right wordage, they justify by saying that, well, he has better abortion regulations, or he has this, or he has that. So that has been really interesting among the Latino vote, I would say.
Another thing that I'm gonna ask a question that is kind of related here, right? Because we're talking about like the differences among Latino voters. We got a question from a viewer. Why is it necessary for Barack Obama to persuade some Black men to vote for Kamala Harris? The issues cannot be more clear. Anyone?
Well, I would say that the simple answer is that the sort of fundamental bedrock of American democracy is that every candidate has to earn every person's vote. And I think that there had been, after 2012, I think this sort of sense among national Democrats that somehow demographics equal destiny, and that Republicans would never be able to earn the votes of Black or Latino Americans just simply because they were not speaking to those communities. And I think that if we learned anything in the 2016 election, we learned that that is not true, and that nobody likes to feel like their vote is taken for granted or that they're not being spoken to by candidates. And I think that's part of it. The other thing is that, as Joanna said, people are not a monolith, right? Like, you cannot assume that somebody who has Guatemalan heritage has the same sort of history or concerns or issues than somebody who is Puerto Rican, for example. Now, we sort of lump them all into sort of this, Latino category, but there is a lot of distance, physically and otherwise, between Guatemala and Puerto Rico. So I think that's part of it. The other part of it is that, unfortunately or fortunately, we are all obsessed with polls. And I think that whenever you see sort of significant changes in, specific demographic groups, that gives reporters something to write about and something to sort of ask questions about, especially if it seems somewhat counterintuitive, because you have sort of the former president with a long and very clear history of making racist statements. And I think the obvious question is, well, why would people who he is targeting support him? And I think that, to be quite honest, breaks the brains of a lot of people and are sort of struggling to find explanations for that. I would say that polling has gotten a lot worse over the last 10 years. And I think that it is especially something to take with several grains of salt as you sort of try to look at smaller and smaller groups in the poll, especially because if you're like me, the last time you answered a phone number that you didn't recognize on your cell phone was approximately 2008. And I think that that really limits the ability of polls to sort of reach a representative sample of voters. So there's a lot of different things going on, but I think, you know, the fundamental issues that we all have to remember that like it is not accurate to say that all Black people are going to vote one way and all Latino people are going to vote for that way. It would sound ridiculous if you said something like all women are going to vote the same way, even though we know there's a huge gender gap in this election, but everybody's got to compete for the votes that they want to earn.
And that it has, to your point, Heather, right? It has always been the case, right? Because I think we're looking at this, you know, from one side, like that question of, you know, just because the candidate is Black does not mean that all Black people are just going to automatically vote for that person. Up until 2008, it was always the case that any person of color, any woman who was casting a ballot for someone who was not demographically like them. So it is no different now. Just because the candidate is a woman or a woman of color does not mean that that person can also have the vote of someone who does not look like them, or you know, come from the same demographic. So that has always been the case. But it sounds like some folks we have to remind and clarify. So then there's some folks who are still not decided. I guess my question is, how is that, right? How is it that anyone at this point in the election is undecided? What are you still looking for?
Well, I think that they're probably not telling the truth either to themselves or the people that they're asking the question, because we know that most people who consider themselves undecided have either a history of voting consistently one party or another party, or either feel like they don't want to sort of admit it out loud, either to themselves or to the pollster. So I think that, you know, sort of the widest possible universe of the undecided voters in this upcoming presidential election are about 5% of the vote. Now, obviously, that is more than enough to tip the election in either direction. But I think that the actual true universe of people who are actually undecided and are actually going to vote is much, much smaller. And it's almost impossible to measure those voters with any sort of rigor or certainty. And I think that, you know, it's sort of just makes me do sort of a big shrug, become the shrug emoji guy. And there's not really any way that you can really tell whether people are actually undecided or if there's just something holding them back, either from participating in total or sort of, you know, being clear about which way that they're going to go.
Often it can just be a sign of dissatisfaction as well, that they're not
like either
content
candidate.
with either choice is really what it is. And I will share, I just had to fill out, you know, forms for the doctor's office for my child. And there was a question that I'm like, it's a yes or a no, but I'm not sure. And that's not really an option. It just goes into the undecided bucket when perhaps it's just,
I check them both.
I can't believe
Can't
that
do
these
that
are
in the
the
ballot
two I
box.
have to choose between, you know?
Or I'll just circle them. I don't like either of these right here, but you can't do that when you're voting for president. Johanna?
No, we're just gonna say. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people who are undecided, right? It seems like many of them are the younger voters, from what I've been able to gather, and it really comes down to what they believe in, right? I mean, the war that's happening in Gaza with you know, that's a really hot topic, you know, with who they're gonna vote for. And what I also find interesting is what's going to affect their life or not. You know, who's the less of what's that
Lesser of two evils.
saying?
Lesser of two evils.
Yes, there we go. Yes, and that's the conversation that I constantly have. So it's like it's almost like they know who they're going to vote for, but then they have an issue with something else. So it's like they're right in the middle. But at the end of the day, you know, I think the conversation is it better to vote than not to vote?
Not to vote, than to vote. Okay. So obviously in Illinois, we're typically blue. So for the most part, we know that Illinois is probably going to swing for Kamala Harris. But that doesn't mean Illinois didn't have a role, obviously, in this election. And, you know, one particular Illinois official was pretty relevant. Governor Pritzker, we know that he was considered as a fairly serious potential running mate for Kamala Harris and not chosen. Amanda, Heather, give us a sense of, how he and his money are playing into this race for her.
I mean, he is a surrogate for the Harris campaign, but he'd been a surrogate for Biden as well. So he's certainly out there making the rounds. I think that you would have people question, is he doing this for Harris? And yes, I mean, he's a lifelong Democrat, but also potentially for his own political future. He certainly is not one to shy away from seeking opportunity. He is also playing a notable role through his PAC. We don't know if anybody else is pouring millions of dollars into it or lesser amounts, but we know that he is, and that is trying to pass pro abortion or reproductive choice measures on ballots, so constitutional questions in states outside of Illinois. So he's playing a role in the Harris campaign. He's playing a bigger role, I think, in those states and for constitutional questions, but also they're spending some money on races for the Senate. As of course, it's not just the White House that is in play, but really a lot at stake when you look at DC and the House and the Senate. And so Pritzker playing a role there. And then, of course, really all of Chicago's role, whether you wanted to play it or not, particularly if you live anywhere near the United Center, you played a role in hosting when the city hosted the Democratic National Convention. And that was in large part to Governor J.B. Pritzker, his relationships, his team's lobbying, and yes, his vast amounts of wealth, which he contributed to the DNC and also to throwing some personal parties and sort of just feting the who's who nationally in Democratic politics during that
What do
period.
we think might be next for him? Like he could run for another term as governor, or if Kamala Harris is elected, could he seek an appointment and receive it?
Can I steal a line from Heather in one election at a time?
No!
No, part of it really depends on the results of this campaign, right?
Yeah.
Would he have an opportunity to serve in a cabinet? That would only be, of course, if Kamala Harris wins the presidential contest. So there is that. He has not been asked in a while, but when sort of prodded about that, he got very demure and
Very mindful, very
very
demure.
mindful, very demure. But I guess we don't know. I think it would depend on the opportunity that presents itself. Will there be an opportunity? You asked earlier about Senator Dick Durbin. Will there be a vacancy there? I think the most obvious path could be serving another term as governor, or at least running for it. He would be hard pressed at this juncture, again, given just his financial prowess and the power of incumbency, to have a hard competition, though one never knows. But if he won a third term, there is nothing legally holding him back from that. And should especially Harris lose the presidential contest, something like maintaining his governorship, and as I noted, this sort of other traveling the lands to help out other Democrats would have him poised potentially to make a run at the White House 4 years from now.
We're not going to talk about 4 years from now, though.
Right? That's 2 elections away.
That's 2 elections away. It's more than 2 if you live in Chicago and in Illinois, because there are other elections between now and then. Lightening up a little bit, all 3 of you covered, or you covered both the Republican and the Democratic National Convention, Republicans being in Milwaukee, down the street, Democrats being here in Chicago, also down the street. How do you think, any takeaways, and how do you think Chicago came off in hosting the DNC? Joanna, I want to start with you.
On the spot. No, I think I mean, honestly, I was outside of the Democratic convention. I didn't get to go inside. So my perspective was really just trying to see how everything was on the outside, how people were coming in, what the businesses were like, what the feel was like. And it was running fairly smoothly from the outside. In terms of like the businesses and the people, I mean, The businesses were happy, of course, with having such a big convention come in. And what I found even more fun was just to see people understand what a Democratic convention is. I mean, there was people there who've been there for the last Democratic convention, so that was interesting to hear stories about that. But really, just to also just hear about how the neighborhood has changed, how the community has changed, and just asking questions of what do they know about a Democratic convention. I think that's what I personally took away of, just understanding and hearing from people and hearing their perspective, what this means for the city. I remember taking away from this lady who she was really excited to have the Democratic convention in her backyard because it was an opportunity for the young people to understand how important the election is and for them to have an opportunity to see, everybody come in from different parts of Illinois, or different parts of the state, right? Different parts of different places. And I feel like that's what I took away the most, just the people's experience of having the Democratic convention in their backyard.
Mhm, mhm. Heather, you were outside covering, you were all about covering the delegation. Amanda, we know you were inside for both of them.
Yeah, I think that it was really it was a big test for the Chicago Police Department. There was so much chatter about how they would handle the big pro-Palestinian marches and rallies, especially given the police department's long history of sort of mishandling large gatherings designed to allow people to express their First Amendment rights. And, I think if you talk to anybody at City Hall, they will say that they breathed a huge sigh of relief on August 23rd when sort of everything went off with a hitch, and that while there were certainly big protests and one sort of incident that turned relatively violent, we did not see the wide-scale unrest that some people had been predicting, and honestly, some sort of Republicans seemed to be almost rooting for, hoping that it would be a repeat of 1968, where sort of the chaos outside the convention seemed to sort of translate into a defeat for Democratic nominee Hubert Humphrey. So, I think that they were all very glad of the chance to showcase the best of Chicago. I keep thinking about how amazing the weather was that week and how it was just sort of the perfect week for people to come to Chicago and sort of have their notions about what Chicago is like challenged. And I think that, if it had gone wrong, it would have been a major black mark on the record of Mayor Brandon Johnson. The fact that he presided over this convention that, went off without a hitch, I think has sort of, been a bright spot in a difficult couple of months for him. But, the fact of the matter is that, the Republican convention seems like it took place in a completely different political world, because that was, it started a day after the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania, that former President Trump survived. And it took place at a time where the Democratic nominee was Joe Biden. And that seems like it was a completely different universe. And I think that is, I think that I have sort of trouble just sort of like wrapping my brain around over how much has really changed since mid-July. And I think that's perhaps part of the reason why people are struggling to sort of get their bearings about sort of, what the outcome of next week's vote is going to be.
And Amanda, sorry, before you jump in, I want to remind our viewers, folks who are joining us, if you've got questions, please drop them in the chat or the Q&A before we wrap it up, because you're almost out of time. Go ahead, Amanda.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, I echo all of that sentiment, especially when you talk to people about it. Really, they remark about the weather. So, Chicago put on a show, and Milwaukee was likewise. There was an incident where somebody did lose their life, but it was not really to do with the convention, other than that it was by a police officer who had been brought in from another city because Milwaukee police were going to be busy covering the RNC and what was to do with it. So I think both conventions went off with aplomb in terms of what their parties were seeking from that time. And Chicago did very well in not having, in sort of just the mechanics of having people be able to get around, get to the convention on time. In fact, maybe one of the takeaways, and something that I spoke with a lot of leading Democrats the final day, was, hey, now we showed that we can do it. We need to be like this all the time and keep the trains, literally like CTA trains, running more often, and be this really just attentive to customers and to members of city council's requests for more service. And so Chicago did great then, and they want more of it.
Let's not talk about the lines to get into the convention.
Let's not. There might be lines on election day, obviously. So before we go, how do you all like to vote? I think I'm still undecided, and they say you're supposed to make a plan, right? Because if you wait till election day and then something goes wrong, right? A kid gets sick or your car breaks down or something, and suddenly you can't vote, right? So you got to make a plan. And I haven't made my plan yet. I have my mail-in ballot, and I have to figure out the judges situation, and which retention judges to retain and which ones not to. How do you, so I don't know, is what I'm saying. I'm either gonna vote by mail or give up my vote by mail ballot on election day. I'm not gonna vote early. It's gonna be one of these two
That's
things.
the key tip, Brandis. If you have a mail-in ballot and you're not using it, then bring it with you.
You have to bring it
because
with you. You have to relinquish it.
You have to turn it in.
Yes.
So that this is to protect against somebody voting twice,
You
voting
can't vote
in
twice.
person
This is
and
to
by mail.
prevent against
So-
the alleged fraud that is.
Exactly. So
that
that's
is
what I
often
do too, Brandis.
decried.
I mean, that is the plan. I think that you know where your ballot is, and that you are able to put it in a mailbox so that it is postmarked by or on election day in order for it to count. Obviously, no later will do, or a drop-off ballot box. Those are all around the city as well, and you can do that on election day. Just know that if you have your mail-in ballot, that you have to bring it with you. And I believe that you have a couple more days to request a mail-in ballot if you have not already done so. Illinois does
I think
have
you have
a
until the
law that
31st
means
in
you're
Chicago.
automatically signed up. If you requested one before, you have an opportunity to really get that mail-in ballot sent to you automatically from here on out.
Yes. Yeah. How are you all voting? I think I'm going to take my kid with me on election day because it's a holiday. The kids are out of school.
Yeah.
So I think I'll take my 11-year-old with me.
I already voted by mail, and I can see with the handy dandy ballot tracker from the Cook County Clerk's office that it's been received. Now, that ballot won't be counted until election night, but I do feel I'm glad to know that it's there and that it's been received. I am one of those people who used to always vote on election day, but after the pandemic, really enjoy the ease of voting sort of when I have time in a quiet sort of location, especially when elections like this, there are a ton of judges and
Be
a
in the
lot
box
of,
for a long
yeah.
time.
And it is not sort of a swift process, especially if you're sort of looking them up one by one as you go. So I would encourage people to, have a plan before you get to the polling booth if you're going to vote in person on election day. Just another reminder is that if you want your ballot to arrive by election day, you should probably get it in the mail tomorrow. But in Illinois, as long as it's postmarked, as Amanda said, by or on election day, it has 14 days before the election will be certified here in Illinois. So it can arrive at any point from then on. So each state has a little bit of different rules. And if you live in the city or if you live in the suburbs, you can vote in person early now through election day. So really there is any number of ways to vote. You just have to sort of do it. Brandis.
Gotta know which one you want to do. Joanna.
Plan. I need to finalize my plan too, Brandis. But I like to vote in person. I think this just comes from like memories of being a child and when my parents became citizens. It was really important for them, and I would remember my dad like sitting in the living room or in the kitchen and just looking up or making me look them up as a kid and trying to understand what everything means in the ballot. So I find that still really nice to go and do it in person.
Yeah. The other cheat about getting a mail-in ballot is that, if you don't necessarily like, and you can look this up, right? But like, I didn't want to look it up. I just opened the ballot and I'm like, oh, there's an issue on here that I don't know how I want to vote on. So then, what, I need to go look this up, and then make a decision. So it also kind of forces you to literally do a little bit of homework, whether or not you choose to mail that ballot in or relinquish it when you go to your polling place or to vote early. I think that is a good place to leave it, though, with some good tips on how to vote. And and Tim has also dropped in the chat, WTTW News Explains. It's our award-winning series. We've got a whole bunch of them there, but there is one, the one that Heather mentioned earlier, about what happens to your ballot when you go to vote. That's an interesting one too. So you're welcome to check that out. We're gonna leave it there because we're journalists and we've all got a deadline to get to. My thanks to our WTTW News Spotlight Politics team, Heather Sharon, Joanna Hernandez, and Amanda Vinicky. And of course, thank you to our viewers for joining today's WTTW News Community Conversation. Please submit any story ideas, topics, issues that you think WTTW News needs to be covering to the email listed in the chat box. It's going to be coming in shortly. Stay tuned for it. And of course, if you enjoyed this conversation, please join us tonight and tomorrow night for Chicago Tonight at 5:30, on Wednesday night for Chicago Tonight Black Voices. And on Thursday, you can join Joanna for Chicago Tonight Latino Voices, Amanda on Friday for Weekend Review. That's all at 5:30. Finally, I want to encourage you again to visit the WTTW News Voter Guide. It is your one-stop shop for everything you need to know before voting in the general election. You will find, as we mentioned, candidate profiles that include detailed and issue-based questionnaires, video interviews that allow you to hear directly from the candidates where they stand on the big topics, an easy-to-navigate compilation of Legal Bar Association ratings for the sometimes difficult-to-navigate judicial races that we mentioned. You can visit our website at WTTW.com/voter guide. There's a link also posted in the chat early on, so scroll up. And once again, take care. Please remember to vote and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.